Hey, and welcome to part 4 of Blender's Beginner Series tutorials. This episode we're into texturing and materials. We're going to be learning how to apply the different materials and textures to our models. We're also going to learn how to use image textures to place images over our scene and onto our models, as well as learning a little bit about adding bumps and textures and things. All in all, it's just going to be a quick, but well, it's not quick, it's an hour-long tutorial, but it tells you everything you need to know to get started. So let's get on with it and find out what we've got. If we just select our saved blend from last time and set it into the 3D view, what we can see is our scene. And firstly, what we intend to do is add some colour to the car, colour the wheels, add an image texture to the wheels for the hubs, and put a nice reflective window surface on the windows. And then we'll get on with the background and we'll do the trees in exactly the same way as the car. So to do that, let's first select the car by right clicking, and then we'll go over to our properties tabs, and if we go over to this end here, if we just hover over and scroll back with our mouse wheel, that scrolls the tabs bar so that we can access the menus. Now if we just select this icon, the circle, that's our textures tab, and it brings up this whole menu of textures, and it automatically creates a texture slot. And in this first box is the name of the material. I'm going to actually just make this window a little bit wider by hovering the mouse over the edge. I'm going to press my left mouse button, just drag it a little bit wider so we can read all the labels. Now if I left click over the name of the material, I can change that, and we're going to call this car body. Lovely. And then press enter to confirm that. Now underneath the name we have a selection of options. The first option is the surface option, which relates to the actual grey surface of the model, and that's where we'll be putting our textures today. Alternatively, you can texture the wireframe as an option, and that actually creates a texture and a model that is just the wireframe with interesting textures. You can do all sorts of fun effects with that. Before I continue, let me just start my screencast again, and you can pick up the keyboard shortcuts from this panel here. Volume creates the texture on the internal part of the mesh, and you would use that for smoke effects, fire, liquids. And the final one is a halo, which puts a texture on the vertex point, and it gives you a little starlight effect, and that's quite fun. It's good for particles mainly, but you could use it for weird things. But we will switch back to the surface view for now. Your next panel is a preview window, which allows you to see how the texture is going to look. It's not 100% accurate, but it's a good representation. There are different options. You can see it on a flat plane, the sphere, on how it looks on a cube, and the monkey head is good for seeing the texture on a uneven surface. Then you have strands, which is useful for checking textures of hairs, grass and such like. And then finally you have like a background sky preview, how it looks in the world space. We'll stick to the regular sphere at the moment. Now we come to the textures themselves. The first panel is the diffuse texture, which is the main colour of your texture, and by clicking on the white panel it brings up this colour wheel, and you can use that to scroll around and find a colour that you like. And for this model I'm going to just use a nice sharp red there. That looks nice, good for a car. We'll just click off there. In this drop down menu at the side, the diffuse type is set to Lambert. We have a selection of shaders, Orania, Toon Shader, Miniart and Fresnel, and the different options just change the way light and shadows affect the colours. So if we look at the Toon Shader, for example, you'll see that there's really heavy shading and the colour itself is weird. If we look at the Miniart, you'll see how we have this shadow that comes around the back of the object. That's helpful for adding shadows, obviously. I'll just carry on. We'll stick to Lambert for now. The intensity allows us to adjust the brightness of the colour, so we can reduce that down or bring it right up. But the default 0.8 is fine. And another thing we can use is the ramp, which allows us to overlay a separate group of colours from an alpha, which is a transparent colour, to any other colour that we would like to use. To use the ramp, you just simply left click on it, bring up the colour bar, and you can choose the colour of that ramp. And as you can see, we get some interesting effects. If I bring that more into the orange reds, you can see we've got a little pink thing going on. If I go back to the opposite side, this is our alpha colour. We can bring that up. We can change the transparency of it. If we bring it all the way up to 1, it becomes a full colour, but that hides the base colour behind the ramp colours. You can add sections. If we add a couple of sections and change the... oops, press the wrong button there. If we add a couple of sections and change the colours there, you can see we start to get some interesting effects. Nice little rainbow car. Let's not have a rainbow car. We'll turn the ramp off for this model. But you can see how playing with the ramp and the diffuse colours can have some interesting effects. Let's turn the alpha back down just so we can bring back the base colour. Yeah, that's all fun. Shall we have a quick rendering, just see what that looks like in the actual 3D view? Wow, that's pretty cool actually. That's not bad. That's not bad. Let's oh, forget about it. Let's go back to the 3D view. Turn the ramp off. We'll just have a nice red car. In the next panel we have our specular, which means the highlights where light hits the object. We have this white highlight. We can change that again. We can make it a nice blue if we wish. You can see how that's changed on the model in the preview, a nice bright green one. Changing the specular, you can create different lighting effects without adjusting the lamps. If we were to render that on this model, we wouldn't really see any specular highlights because it's all sharp edges and there aren't any areas really where the light has an effect. So we'll leave that as white. We'll slide up these red, green and blue sliders so that the colour point is in the middle, and a white specular is fine for this. Well, if I just show you on the monkey, you can see how the specular highlights help to illuminate the model and define its shape. And the hardness factor, if I increase that, you'll see how these highlights become sharper. And again we have a selection of options. Wad ISO, that makes it look a little bit liquid, almost like a wet look. Toon shader, that gives you really intense highlights, and it's good for dual tone models where you would have a toon diffuse. There's Blin, those are really small sharp highlights, good plasticky look. Pong, again a little bit softer, a little bit plasticky, but we'll stick to the default Cocteau. Bringing the hardness down, of course it was too far, we can soften the highlights and get different effects, make it more plastic or more cloth-like. The more you bring it down, the bigger area that the specular affects. If I click on it and just type in a value, I'll return it to the default. And then if we look at the intensity, that just increases and decreases the brightness from no specular at all to really bright highlights. Let's bring that back to the middle. Okay, so those are the two main colours. We also have a shading option. Emit helps makes it look as if it's illuminated. You can actually use the emit value to create lights in the scene. Shadeless just turns off all the shadows, and you get this silhouette effect. Ambient, that's the amount of shading from the world. Didn't really show anything on the preview. Translucency is how much light passes through the object. If we turn that right up, you can see the shadows are a little bit different now. That's good for organic models like leaves, skin and stuff. Tangent shading, that just adjusts the shading options. And cubic interpolation does nothing obvious, so we don't need to play with that. Transparency options, just change how see-through an object is. If we adjust the alpha, we can see through the object. That's good. You use that for glass, liquids. The Fresnel value. Fresnel helps to pull the transparency towards the edges. You can see that pulling it in there. But we're not going to be using transparency in this one. Mirror, that provides reflections, and we're going to be using that on the windows, so we'll come back to that. Subsurface scattering is for when light hits an object and it can travel through and then reflect off a colour underneath, so you get, it can give you realistic skin surfaces that are quite difficult to achieve without having that effect. We won't be using that in this tutorial. The strand options are for grass and hair, and then there is a whole bunch of options that we don't really need. And these are things we'll go through in a more in-depth tutorial. Shadows, this is the important one. It's set by default to receive, which means shadows from other objects can fall on it. Cast buffer shadows, the object itself creates shadows. Cast only, it will just block the light without actually rendering, so it would cast a shadow on the floor but you wouldn't see the car. I'll show you that quickly. If we turn it off, as you can see in the preview, the colour is gone but the shadow remains. If I press F12, you can see what we mean. We have the wheels and there's simply the shadow on the floor. And that's useful for VFX scenes where you need to create objects that aren't really there. But we need the car there for this tutorial, so I'll turn that off. The one other option that we need to check for this scene is receive transparent. And what that does is, if there's an object with a transparent background, the light will go through the transparency and just create the shadow of the actual shape of the object. And we'll look at that later when we come to create the leaves that we're going to use in the particle system. And you'll understand what I mean then. Okay. So that's all the rules. We've already set up the base colour for the actual car model. You've probably forgotten now and been totally overwhelmed and have no idea what's going on, but we'll pick you back up to speed right now. Because we're going to start making some more materials. And the first material we want to make after the car body is the windows, and to do that, because the windows are on the same mesh, we have to create a new material. So we press this plus icon and then we press the new material button and we get a new material 001. If I click on that again and type in Windows, we can now come down to the diffuse colour, and we have it as a slight blue colour, and we make it slightly darker. The darkness will help the mirror effect when it comes to reflecting the background. The specular, do we need... The specular will increase the hardness to 200. That'll give us a nice sharp reflection. And we're not going to use transparency on the windows, because that would involve having to model the inside of the car for the transparency to show something. At the moment it would just show an empty shape, which would be horrible. But we are going to use the mirror options so that when we do render it, we end up with reflections of the trees in the background showing up on our car windows as they go past. And we will adjust the reflectivity. We don't want it totally mirror-like. If we put it all the way up to 1, it would just be a total chrome-like mirror. So if we want to keep some of the colour, so if we bring it to 2.9, looks about right. The reflectivity colour looks fine. The Fresnel, let's see what happens if we adjust the Fresnel. That pushes the reflectivity more to the edges, and no, we don't need that. We'll turn that, keep that at 0, keep the reflectivity colour to white. Reflection depth, we only need that at 2. The depth itself is how many times the mirror would reflect an object. So if you had 2 mirrors facing each other in the real world, they would continue to reflect infinitely. But we don't need to step up that far, and that would take forever to render. But we'll leave it at 2 so it does reflect the surroundings. Max distance we'll leave at 0. Gloss 1 is fine. If we turn the gloss amount down, you'll see how it becomes kind of speckly and rough. And that's kind of useful for making frosted glass and things like that. Brushed metals. But we want it a nice polished surface this time. And again, we'll go down to the shadows panel and click receive transparent. And if we hit render, you'll see it's not on the model. So we need to go into edit mode to apply that effect to the car windows. So we head to edit mode and we select each of the windows that we wish to have the material on. I need to be in face select mode. I've already got the front windscreen selected, so I hold down shift and right click the 2 side windows. I will select the Windows material by left clicking in the materials panel, and in edit mode you get this second menu, and we click assign, and that puts the second material onto the windows. We can come out of edit mode now. You can see in the 3D view we now have those pretty windows. If we press F12, you'll see they're an awkward grey colour, and the reason for that is because the reflectivity is reflecting the grey from the background and the surface and the environment. And when we put an actual environment in this space, you'll see that the mirroring actually does reflect what's around it. So okay, so let's move on now and we'll do the wheels. And we need to do the wheels a little bit differently, because on this inner rim of the wheel we're going to use an image texture to create the look of the hubcaps. We're also going to use a material from the panel here, which we will make for the tyres, and that will just be a black dark grey material. But first what we need to do is go into 3D view, select the wheels, go into edit mode, and what we need to do is what's called an unwrap. And what an unwrap does is it takes the 3D space of the mesh and it transfers it to a 2D window that you can use to overlay an image texture. So if I head down, if you see where this editor type is, right next to it there's a little series of lines, and if I hover my mouse over it, it turns to a crosshair. If I press with my left mouse button and drag those lines across, you'll see my window has now split into two. I want to go to this menu here, bring up the editors menu and click on UV image editor, and that brings us back into our rendering image space. But we don't want to see the render image, so we'll click where it says render result, we'll click X, and it brings us this 2D grid, and this is where we're going to put our image and unwrap our wheel. But first we need an image, so if we minimize Blender for the moment and open our browser, there we go. Now we need a decent hubcap image, so we'll go steal one from Google Images. We'll just type in hubcaps, let Google do its thing. Do your thing, Google. There we go. Click on images and we get a selection of rims that we can use, and we'll just go through and find one that's quite nice and usable. I think this one for my car. You can of course choose any of them, but make sure that you choose a rim that's face on. So this one is suitable. This one would be quite suitable, as would this. But this one here, this wouldn't be suitable because it's on an angle. This one is also unsuitable, but this one's fine. This one also fine. Just go find the one that I was talking. Hubcapsforless.com. Thank you very much for your image. I will just select that. Right click, save image as. And now we can close down Google, open up Blender again into our UV window, click on image, open image. Now you go down to the file where you saved your hubcap, and that brings us up the file menu. If we go to the top, we can see these icons for displaying how Blender displays our files. If I click on the thumbnail icon, we can see all the pictures that are available to us in that file, and this is the file I've just chosen, so I will select that, press open image, and now we have our hubcap all nicely in the window. Now I'm going to just turn off my tool panel and my end panel by hovering my mouse in the workspace and pressing T and N. I'm going to press 3 on my number pad to go into side view. Scroll over there. I will press A twice to select all. You'll notice my picture disappeared. It's alright, it's still in the system. If I go down to this little image icon, I can tell it to come back. Now, back in the editor window, my wheel, I need to unwrap it so it covers the image, and I do that by pressing U, and I get a UV mapping menu, and I have the options to unwrap, Smart UV Project, Light Map Pack, and others. But for this image, I will choose Project from View Bounds, and that projects the image as it's seen from my view into the 2D workspace. And if I now hover my mouse over that and I press A, it selects all of those. And what I want is, if you look at the actual model, you'll see that we have the tyre and then the rim. And the tyre is these first faces are these faces here, so that's my tyre. So I don't want any of that on the rim. So if I press S to scale, just pull it out slightly, you'll notice that this thin edge, which corresponds to what we've been calling the rim, is slightly off center with the actual model. So if I press G, I can line that up a bit better. I just pressed G and grabbed the whole selected mesh. And now if I just press S to scale it down just a fraction, I don't want to go too much, but I'm still getting some overlap on some of the bottom faces. So I need to constrain it to an axis. Now in the 3D space we have 3 axes, an X, Y and Z. In the 2D space we only have 2, an X and a Y. So if I press S and Y, it constrains it to the Y axis, and if I can just really carefully, just slowly, don't want to go too far. Let me just start that again. S, Y. That's better. Now if I drag it up slightly, G, Y. That's it. And now the edge that corresponds to the rim is within the rim of the image, the wheel image, and that will be shown up on the actual mesh. If I go into my 3D workspace menu bar and I click on this pop-up menu next to the mode menu. It brings up my viewport shading options, and if I click on the rendered option, we should see nothing. Why is that? Because we haven't put this on an actual texture yet. Ahaha! All we've done at the moment is map the coordinates of the wheel to the 2D coordinates of the image, and we need to now create a texture for the actual wheel to show up that image. And as before, we do that by going to our textures panel, clicking new, and again we get a new material. We will call this car hub. That's a stupid name. We'll call it wheel hub, wheel hub. And we don't need to mess with any of the diffuse shaders. What we need is the texture. These are our materials, and the checkerboard on the tab next to it are our materials, or our textures rather. Now immediately we are giving a default clouds texture, which gives us this weird purple freaky effect. We don't want that. First thing we'll do is name it again, wheel hub, and on the type, if we select that and scroll up, select image or movie. Because we've got the wheel open already in Blender, we don't need to open it from the menu. We can just select from the images, click our hubcap image, and immediately it shows up in the preview window. But in our 3D view window it looks absolutely horrible. We can't even see that there's a hubcap on there. So we need to tell Blender to map the image to the UV coordinates, and we do that by coming down to the mapping field. We can ignore the sampling and image mapping. All we want is the coordinate mapping, and currently it's on generated, which is the default mapping, and we want to press for the menu, go up and select UV, and there you go. It brings up the image that we have as our UVs onto the model. And that's almost the car done. What I want to do is create a separate tyre for the car. I don't want the tyre to be part of the image because we want to change the specular type. So if I go back to solid view and if I show you a little trick, if I press this Vertex Select button, if I click the center vertex, hold down Control and press my plus button on my number keypad, you'll see I grow the selection, and as I click it I can use that to select the whole of that mesh without having to fight individual vertices, and it selects the whole thing very quickly. But that's not the piece that I want selected. What I want is the tyre. So if I press Ctrl I, that now inverts my selection, and you'll see it's inverted those vertexes, which I actually wanted to keep for the sidewall of the tyre. So again, if I press Ctrl+, it grows that selection and reselects all those tyre parts. Now we go back to the materials panel, click the plus button for a new material, click new, change the name to tyre, press enter, go to our diffuse, bring that to not quite black, change the hardness to 10, I think. No, that's too much. Change the hardness to 20. Oops, 200. No. Change the hardness to 20. And we'll reduce the intensity down to 0.107 is good. 0.1 if you just decide to type it in. And now we click assign again. That puts the black on the tyre and leaves us with the rim image on the inner part. If we look at the rendered view, there we go. Because the wheels are mirrored and arrayed using the modifiers, those textures have been automatically copied over to the other wheels without us having to do anything to them, and we can call that little car done. Okay, let's move on to the next section. We'll start on the road surface, and what we want is an actual road image again, and we would like also some grass to go on the sides. So let's head back to Google eventually, one day, and we will type in the search bar ROAD road material. Click on the images, and what we're looking for is something like this, which is a road surface that we can use to map. This one's a lot nicer, it's a lot bigger image as well, so it will map easily. Let's see if there's any others that we like. This one could be interesting. There's no white marks in the middle, though. A picture of a dog in a river. Don't need a dog in a river. Not unless you know the dog, of course. You might put the dog in the river. So we'll click on this one and do the same as before. Right click and save image as, and you'll see I've already done this. So just click save and it's in there. Cancel that for now. Okay, and back in Blender we will take a look now at setting those up. So now we have our texture. So now that we have our texture, what we can do next is select the cylinder that we're using for our floor plane, and if we look at it in edit mode, we'll see that there's not enough faces for us to actually put the road in. If we try to map the road on it now, what would happen is it would be completely filling the whole of the cylinder. So in edit mode we will add the loops that we need to create the road surface, and do that we'll go into front view, press 1, and is it just me or is the keyboard shortcuts not showing up? Oh dear. Wonder how long that's been off. Oh well. We're almost finished, so you can now start watching the screencast. Damn it. Oh well. Now to put our road surface in, we'll just press Ctrl R, and that brings our purple line where it's going to cut the mesh. If we press the left mouse button to confirm that, we'll see it's right in the middle of the car. We don't really want the car to be in the middle of the road, so if I move that slightly to the right, and then I think that's a reasonable size for the road, so I will confirm with left mouse button, and that locks it in place. Now if I press Ctrl R again and slide it in, make the car approximately in the centre of the lane, about there looks good. Left mouse button to confirm again. Now on the opposite side, press Ctrl R to get the loop cut, left mouse button to accept, slide it in until it looks about the same width as the road on the other side. They look good. Press left mouse button to confirm, and that's our road surface. Let's make this a little bit smaller again so we've got more room to work with. Grab this little handle in the corner again, split our window, go to the UV image editor, image, open image, downloads, thumbnail view, our road surface, and open image. We scroll out a bit. We want this image mapped just to this center portion, and we can do that by simply unwrapping it, or we can use seams to cut the road edges out and only unwrap the middle part of the road. And to do that I will bring back my toolbar. Now I have this area of the road selected in my toolbar. Let me just lower the operator panel. In my toolbar there is a section called UV mapping. The unwrap options that we've been using the shortcuts for, and then there is a mark seam and clear seam. If we simply press mark seam on that edge is now turned red underneath the highlighted edges, and if I do the same to the opposite side of the road, I'll press Alt and right click, and that selects everything on the road. Now if I mark seam again, essentially what it's done is it's made a virtual cut through the mesh that only affects the mesh in the 2D plane. It doesn't actually do any damage to the mesh, it just tells Blender that there is a cut here. When you unwrap it, make sure those cuts are separate. So if I now select one edge along the road horizontally and click mark seam, now when it unwraps, it will take this ring and make it into what is essentially just a ribbon of faces. So if I select all the vertexes from this ring by clicking Alt, Shift, right mouse button, keeping Alt and Shift held down, I click the right mouse button in the middle and again on the edge, and you'll see it's done its thing again where it's taken us off the image we needed. So if I bring that back up, and if I press now U to unwrap, which is the same as this unwrap menu that we were just talking about, if I click the menu, you can see it gives us all the options. Hotkey is U. Now if I click unwrap, you'll see it's taken that mesh and laid it out along the image where it thinks it would best fit. Obviously that's not good for us because we want the road to fill this image. So if I press A in my UV image editor, I click and I rotate it by pressing R, Y, 90. Now the best thing we can do is have the whole road fit into these faces. This top section of two faces, we want the whole road to fill that face. So in order to do that, we're going to scale up the faces by pressing S and just dragging on the little wire. We do that until our road fits the faces. We're almost there, we just need to stretch it out, so we need to scale it along the X direction, so S, X, and that brings it out, bring it to the edges, that's about right. And now what's going to happen is this image will map repeatedly to each of the separate faces, and we can see that on our image map under the lights there. We can see the road surface is, for each of the faces, the road surface has mapped once, and then on the next one it maps again, repeating along until it gets to the end. But you'll notice that it's outside of the seams, and the reason for this is because of the Subsurf modifier is causing the image texture to bleed over into the next faces. So to fix that, we just simply add what we call a control loop with Shift R. And now you see as we move that loop in, it brings the road into where it should be. And we do the same on the other side, Control R, bring it in. And we zoom in a bit closer. That looks absolutely fantastic. So that's the road surface done. Except it's not, because we have to turn the road surface itself into a material, as we did before with the wheel hub. So if I go to Materials, we see we have one selected already. If we just rename it as Road. And again, because we're just using the image texture, we'll go from the Materials panel to the Textures panel. We will switch from Generated to UV. Change the type from None to Image or Movie. We will go to the image icon, select the road layer, and that's that road finished. What we can do is we can add a little bump to the road by going down to the Influence panel and clicking on Geometry Normals. And now what that's done, if we look at the preview window in Blender, you can see there is a slight bumpiness to the texture. It's not 100% great because of the texture, but for a simple scene like this, just adding a simple little bit of bump can just make all the difference to the final scene. We can close down our UV window now. We press 0 to look through our camera. Before we go any further, we can see that our camera isn't really in the best position for the scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my camera position by clicking in the N panel. If you just press the N key to bring it up in the 3D window, scroll down to where it says View and Lock Camera to View. And that gives us a red dotted border around our camera, and now when we move around in the scene using our middle mouse button, you can see the camera also changes position. That doesn't look too bad. We'll just do a swap to rendered viewport. I keep forgetting about this because it's quite new in this version. It was only introduced in version 2.68, and as that's what we're using, it's still quite new. The rendered viewport shading mode. That's not too bad, but if we look at the road, you can see the bumps on the road, slightly raised up in places. That's great. I think though we are still too far away, so I'm going to scroll in a touch. That was too much, I think. That really is some quite strong bump mapping. We will change that. Okay, that looks okay, I think. So we'll go back to textured view, uncheck lock camera to view now, and right mouse button to select the floor plane, go back to the floor textures, go down to the bump mapping, and from 1 we will change it to 0.25. And that should make things a little nicer to look at. Yes, there we go. A little too much. If we change it to 0, that's why it was 0.025. We change it to 0.25. That should work. Yes, there we go. Now we've got the bump on the road. It's not too pronounced, but it's obviously there. Now let's put a little bit of colour into the scene. Go into textured view, go into materials, add new material, we'll call it grass. And we'll just change that to a green colour. That looks a reasonable green. We'll turn down the intensity of the specularity. Make the specular a little bit yellow. That looks good. Now we need to assign it to the faces, so let's go back to edit mode. And if we do the same trick that we did with the wheels, if we Alt, Shift, just Alt to select the middle, Control plus to grow the selection, Control I to invert the selection. Yes, we need to have these. So if we press Control plus once more, just to grow the selection right to the edge of the road, press Assign. Now it should all be green. There we go. Check the rendered view. And there we go. We still have a large highlight on the where the lamp is. We can change that momentarily. But the next thing I want to fix is the background sky texture. We'll come out of rendered view. If we click this world icon on the toolbar, we now have a choice of how to do our world settings. And if we check this tick box for blend sky, change the zenith color to a fairly bright bluey, make it a little bit brighter, yeah. And if we change the horizon color, actually let's just bring it up, make it a bit pale. That should work. And ambient color, try moving that to white and see what happens. Have a look in the rendered view. Oh, that's horrifying. Turn that off. There we go. Okay, so we've got our sky, our grass plane, our road, our car, and immediately you can see that there are now reflections within the windows of the car. And in solid mode, I'm going to change this lamp. I do that by right clicking it. And in the operators panel we now have a lamp data panel. So if I click that, it gives us the options for the different types of lamps we can use. I'm going to change it to a sun lamp. I'm going to rotate it slightly so it's not quite vertical. I'm going to move it up. Just have it so it's aiming down at the car slightly. I can go into my camera view by pressing 0, scroll in a little bit, and just have a look at how that appears in the rendered view. That's not too bad. It might be that looks fine. We can go with that. Oops, not wireframe. We want solid mode at least. So now we've done the world, we've done the ground and the car. Finally, we just need to do the trees. And those exactly the same. So just going to use a procedural texture. We'll have the first one named trunk. Trunge. Okay. And we'll have the next one called leaves. Start with the leaves, we'll just go to the diffuse there. Have a nice bright green for the leaves. Specular we will put into the yellow. Hardness. Oops. Hardness 100. And while we're here, let's see if we can add a bit of a bump map to it, just to give it a bit of variety. Click the Materials panel, click New, call it Leaves. We'll leave it as a clouds texture. Leave the mapping as generated. We'll leave it as a grayscale. Size we will bring down to make it a straight 0.1. 0.1. And we'll turn off colour. We'll turn on normal. We'll reduce the normals to 0.15. And now if we go back to our textured view, it's not, you can see a little bit of the bump mapping on there, but not much, so we'll increase the size of it to 0.25. And that looks a bit better. There's the bump mapping is it just gives that little bit of variety again. So with the trunk selected, trunk material selected, we'll jump into edit mode. Select that ring by pressing Alt and right mouse button. Ctrl plus to select the whole of the object. We will create a nice brown. So if we drag our colour wheel into the orangey section, drag the darkness down so it's a reasonable brown colour. Now the trunks are going to be rather small, so I'm not going to put any bump mapping on them. I'll assign that to the trunk. Press Ctrl I to invert the selection. Ctrl plus to grow the selection so it encompasses all the leaves area. Select my leaves material, press assign. Now I need my other tree, so I'll go back to object mode, select the other tree, go into edit mode, and now we're just going to use exactly the same materials, and to do that I will alt select the trunk, Ctrl plus to grow the selection to the top of the trunk, and rather than making a new material with the same settings, if I click on the material menu, I can now select from the menu any of the materials that we have already created. If I click the trunk, you'll see it automatically goes brown. I click Ctrl I to invert the selection, Ctrl plus to grow the selection to the leaf area. I hit the plus key, select from the drop down menu, select the leaves, click assign, and now both objects, even though they're laying on top of each other, don't worry about that, both objects have the same materials. That's it, that's our scene done. If I now switch back to object mode, go back to the first layer, we can see we have everything we need. We have a background, foreground, full car, lamps, cameras in position, the trees are on the bottom layer ready for the next lesson, and we are good to go. So until then, let's save our work, file, save as, and because this is the same blend, and I put the number 3 at the end because last time was the third lesson, if I click on this plus icon, that little 3 jumps to a 4 and it'll create a new blend, or you can just simply rename it entirely, it's up to you. And save as Blender file, and we are ready for the next lesson, which will be adding the particle systems to place the trees in the scene, and a second particle system to blow leaves over the top of the car and into the scene. If you want, you can render out a shot of your scene by pressing F12. Show us what you've got so far. Save it out with the images. Save image. Save as image, or press F3. Call it whatever you want. It saves as a PNG. You can change that to a JPEG from this drop down menu if you wish. PNG is fine. Save as image file, and go stick it on our Facebook page. The link is in the description, and don't forget to subscribe to catch the next lesson, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.